In Heat, Neil McCauley is presented as an idea more than a man. He has no childhood, no attachments, no visible past, only rules. Move fast, stay clean, walk away in 30 seconds if the heat is around the corner. On screen, this level of discipline feels almost philosophical, as if crime itself could be reduced to a pure equation, where emotion is the only variable that causes failure. McCauley isn't chasing money or status. He's chasing control. That illusion is why the character lingers. Viewers aren't just watching a criminal, they're watching a theory tested in real time. Can a human being truly live without ties? Can someone exist entirely outside relationships, memory, and consequence? Heat invites us to believe the answer might be yes, at least for a while, long enough to become a legend. But this is where the investigation begins. Because Neil McCauley was not just a screenwriter's invention, he was inspired by a real man, Neil McCauley, a professional robber whose life was far less poetic than the myth that followed. No philosophy, no romantic detachment, just surveillance reports, behavioral patterns, and a name already known to police long before the final shot was fired. The film turns distance into strength. Reality treated distance as a clue. Where cinema sees purity, investigators see repetition. Where the movie finds meaning, real life delivers something colder. Inevitability. This story is not about which version is more compelling. It's about why one version became timeless and the other was quietly erased. Because the real Neil McCauley didn't disappear into legend. He disappeared into a closed case file. In Heat, Neil McCauley is not portrayed as a gangster. In the traditional sense, he is presented as a system. Everything about him is built around precision, discipline, and detachment. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't explain himself. He doesn't improvise. Every move is calculated, every relationship temporary, every rule absolute. This is not a criminal driven by impulse. This is a man who believes control itself is survival. Hollywood frames this control as purity. McCauley lives without attachments, without family, without emotional residue. The famous rule, don't let yourself get attached to anything you are not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds, becomes the moral spine of the character. It is repeated, reinforced, and visually proven throughout the film. Whenever emotion threatens efficiency, McCauley cuts it off, clean, immediate, final. On screen, this reads as strength. The film's pacing reinforces the myth. Long silences, minimal dialogue, wide city shots. McCauley moves through Los Angeles like a ghost, present but unreachable. Violence, when it happens, is not chaotic, it is methodical. Jobs are rehearsed, teams are vetted, mistakes are punished instantly. There is no room for sentiment, only execution. The result is a character who feels almost inhuman, more principle than person. This is why audiences admire him. Neil McCauley on screen represents the fantasy of absolute self-control, a man untouched by fear, regret, or contradiction. In a world defined by noise and compromise, he appears clean, quiet, and focused. Crime becomes less about greed and more about professionalism. The robbery is not theft, it is craft. But this framing hides something critical. The film treats McCauley's isolation as a choice, not a condition. It presents emotional detachment as something sustainable, even noble. Relationships are portrayed as weaknesses. Connection is framed as exposure. In cinematic terms, McCauley is strongest when he is most alone. That idea is seductive and deeply misleading. What the movie never questions is whether this level of detachment can exist outside fiction. Whether a human being can operate indefinitely, without patterns, without habits, without leaving traces behind. The myth assumes that discipline erases visibility, that control eliminates vulnerability, that rules replace reality. On screen, it works because cinema only has to last 2.5 hours. Real life lasts much longer, and the moment time enters the equation, perfect control stops being a philosophy and becomes something else entirely. That is where the real Neil McCauley begins to diverge from the myth. Outside the mythology of heat, the real Neil McCauley was not an idea, he was a file, a pattern, a name that kept reappearing in police reports, surveillance notes, and unsolved robberies across Chicago in the early 1960s. There was no philosophy attached to him, no grand theory of detachment. What existed instead were habits, routes, timing, and associates. The quiet fingerprints every invisible criminal leaves behind. The real McCauley did not live without ties. He lived with repeat behavior. He favored certain neighborhoods. He returned to familiar locations. He worked within a recognizable window of hours. These choices weren't emotional, they were practical, but practicality creates consistency, and consistency creates visibility. Investigators didn't need a confession to know him. They needed time, patience, and correlation. Unlike the film's version, McCauley was not a master of isolation. He relied on logistics, safe places, and people who knew when to keep quiet. That reliance mattered. It created pressure points. Every stop, every contact, every routine narrowed the search. The more disciplined he became, the more predictable he grew. Control did not erase his footprint, it sharpened it. There was no aura of existential calm around the real McCauley. He did not speak in rules or principles. He avoided attention not because of ideology, but because attention accelerates closure. His life was smaller than the film suggests, not minimalist, but constrained. The city was not a canvas. It was a map he could only use so many times before it folded back on him. This is the contradiction Hollywood smooths over. The movie presents detachment as a way to stay free. Reality treated detachment as a data problem. A man without noise still produces signals. A man without relationships still has patterns. And a man who believes discipline equals invisibility eventually forgets that systems watch for behavior, not emotion. McCauley's reputation among police was not that of a criminal philosopher. It was simpler and more dangerous, persistent. He kept working. He kept returning. He stayed active long enough for the margins to shrink. When officers finally confronted him, it wasn't because he broke his rules. It was because time caught up. The film needs a ghost to ask a question about control. Reality produced a man to answer it, and the answer was brutal. No one remains unseen forever. The most famous rule associated with Neil McCauley is also the most misleading. Walk away from anything in 30 seconds if you feel the heat around the corner. On screen, this principle sounds like absolute freedom, a way to sever attachment before it becomes weakness. It suggests that detachment equals immunity, that emotional distance can erase consequence. But this idea only works in cinema, where time is compressed and patterns are invisible by design. In real investigations, detachment is not absence, it is a different kind of presence. A man without family still has locations. A man without friends still has roots. A man without emotion still has habits. The belief that cutting emotional ties removes exposure misunderstands how systems observe behavior. Law enforcement doesn't look for feelings, it looks for repetition. The real danger of McCauley's philosophy is that it mistakes emotional discipline for operational invisibility. The film presents his life as clean and frictionless, but friction is what reveals risk early. Relationships create noise, but they also create variation. Total isolation produces consistency, and consistency is exactly what surveillance depends on. The quieter the life, the clearer the signal. There is another flaw the movie never addresses. Detachment limits options. When something goes wrong, a network absorbs shock. Isolation concentrates it. A man who relies only on himself has no buffer when circumstances change. No redundancy. No flexibility. The moment a routine is compromised, there is nothing to fall back on except escape, and escape itself becomes a pattern. Cinema frames McCauley's isolation as strength because it removes contradiction. He never hesitates. He never negotiates. He never adapts emotionally. But real-world survival depends on adaptation, not purity. Criminals who last are not the coldest, they are the most responsive. They bend, they adjust, they blur their own outlines. McCauley's philosophy does the opposite. It sharpens the outline until it becomes traceable. The lie of detachment is seductive because it promises control without cost. No attachments, no consequences, no mess. But reality is not impressed by principles. It measures time, movement, and probability. And over time, even the most disciplined life accumulates data. McCauley believed rules could replace connection. Reality proved that rules create patterns. And patterns are exactly what systems are built to find. By the time the real McCauley realized this, detachment was no longer protection. It was evidence waiting to be closed. The real ending of Neil McCauley did not resemble a duel, a moral choice, or a philosophical stand. There was no symmetry, no reflection, and no cinematic meaning. There was only contact, identification, and closure. When McCauley was finally confronted by police in Chicago, the encounter lasted seconds. No speeches, no hesitation, no final rule to follow. Just a suspect who had been located, tracked, and removed. This is the detail Hollywood never needs and never wants. The real McCauley didn't die because he broke his code. He didn't die because emotion caught up with him. He died because time did. Years of activity had produced enough data, enough patterns, enough confidence for law enforcement to move from observation to action. The system did what systems are designed to do. It closed the loop. There was no mythology inside that moment. No one wondered what McCauley represented. No one debated his philosophy. To police, he was not an idea, he was a target whose file was finally complete. His death did not symbolize anything. It solved something. That difference matters. In Heat, Neil McCauley's ending is framed as a choice. He hesitates. He feels something. He deviates. The audience is invited to believe that attachment was his fatal flaw. Reality rejects that narrative entirely. The real McCauley did not fall because he loved or wanted or stayed too long. He fell because no operating criminal remains unobserved forever. The silence after his death was total. No ripples, no reprisals, no philosophical aftershock. Files were archived, streets returned to normal. The system absorbed the event and moved on. That is the most unsettling truth of all. When a real McCauley disappears, the world does not pause to reflect. It simply continues. This is the brutal difference between cinema and investigation. Cinema needs meaning. Investigation needs resolution. The real Neil McCauley did not become a legend. He became a line item marked closed. And in the logic of reality, that is the only ending that exists. By the time Heat reached audiences, Neil McCauley had already been transformed, not from criminal to hero, but from police file to philosophy. Cinema didn't invent his actions. It reframed them. Discipline became virtue. Distance became wisdom. Efficiency became meaning. What was once a record of movements and robberies was elevated into a meditation on control, choice, and identity. This conversion required subtraction. Context was removed. Consequence was muted. Routine was replaced with ritual. The film distilled years of surveillance and repetition into a few elegant rules, turning operational habits into a worldview. The result is seductive. A criminal who seems to live above randomness, untouched by noise, governed only by principle. In that version, failure feels tragic rather than statistical. Hollywood also simplified causality. On screen, McCauley's end arrives because he chooses to break his rule. Emotion intrudes. Attachment compromises discipline. The lesson is clean and memorable. Reality is messier and colder. The real McCauley was not undone by feeling. He was undone by time, patterns, and accumulation. Systems don't punish hesitation. They close gaps once probability crosses a threshold. This is the most important edit the film makes. It replaces inevitability with choice. Choice flatters the audience. It suggests agency where there was mostly math. It turns a closure into a climax. And in doing so, It converts investigation into drama, something to be watched rather than understood. There's another effect. By presenting McCauley as a lone, disciplined professional, the film erases the infrastructure that makes crime legible: routes, contacts, safe places, repetition. The audience sees purity where investigators see signals. The myth survives because it is clean. The truth disappears because it is boring until it isn't. In the end, cinema didn't just tell a better story. It told a simpler one. A story where control feels achievable, rules feel sufficient, and endings feel deserved. The real world offers none of that comfort. It offers closure without meaning, outcomes without lessons, and files that end not with insight, but with a stamp. That is the final inversion. Film needs legends. Reality needs conclusions. And when a conclusion becomes a legend, it's because everything that made it ordinary was quietly edited out. By the end of this investigation, the question is no longer who Neil McCauley was, but why we wanted him to mean something. On screen, he exists as a concept: discipline without attachment, control without compromise, a man reduced to rules so clean they feel almost moral. Cinema invites us to believe that this kind of life, however cold, is at least coherent, that if you follow the rules perfectly, the world will respond in kind. Reality offers no such symmetry. The real Neil McCauley was not tested by philosophy. He was processed by time, patterns, and probability. He didn't fall because he hesitated or felt too much. He fell because systems observe behavior, not intention. His life didn't end in a moment of meaning. It ended when enough information existed to make his removal efficient. No dialogue, no reflection, just closure. This is why Heat resonates and why it misleads. The film isn't really about crime. It's about the fantasy that self-control can replace reality, that discipline can cancel exposure, that isolation can become freedom. That fantasy is comforting in a chaotic world. It suggests order is possible if you're strong enough to reject connection. But the truth is colder. Detachment does not erase you, it sharpens you. Rules don't make you invisible. They make you consistent. And consistency is exactly what systems are built to find. The real heat was never between two men staring at each other across a city. It was between myth and mechanics, between storytelling and investigation. Hollywood chose meaning. Reality chose resolution. And in the end, only one of them actually closes the file.